Welcome. Leah Gordon is our speaker here today, and I think, as everybody knows, but I'll tell you anyway, she's the assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. She is an intellectual historian, and she's integrating the history of American social thought, the history of American education, and African American history all in this one beautiful first book that we're going to talk about today, From Power to Prejudice, The Rise of Racial Individualism in Mid-Century America. I first had the opportunity to hear Leah talk about this book when I guess it was just the beginning of the book. I think it was 2009, and I remember sitting there thinking, how come I didn't know any of this? I mean, how could I have been working on these topics for most of my career, and I hadn't really thought about the role of history, I guess, and its power in shaping the science I was doing and the tools I was using and in my analysis, me and my fellow social psychologists. More about that later. I just want to say that it was wonderful to hear that and to think to myself, wow, this is someone that we need to hear at CCSRE, and here we have today Leah at CCSRE talking to us, so welcome.
And so I want to thank CCSRE for having the Chautauqua program and the Fellows program, Professor Hazel Marcus in particular, and Mariam Hamandani and Heidi Lopez for helping to put this together. And I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I am excited to hear your questions after that. So I'll start by talking about the three big questions that my book engages. The first set, which are rooted in African American intellectual and political history, involve American debates about the nature and sources of racial oppression, or what many social scientists and civil rights activists in the 1920s, 30s, and 1940s often referred to as the race problem. And this was a catch-all phrase that many scholars in these years used to describe racial prejudice, racial discrimination, racial injustice, as well as racial inequality, at times racial oppression, without always distinguishing between those. At the same time, key questions divided scholars and activists committed to racial justice in these years. What exactly constituted the race problem? What was its primary and tertiary causes? What aspects of the race problem can be changed, and how? Of course, many scholars then as now understood the race issue or the race problem as a war that had to be fought on many fronts. And yet, since how one conceptualizes the nature and sources of a social problem are crucial for imagining solutions, for deciding which front to start with and which one to do next, the vision of the race problem that people had in mind was especially important and practically important. So I'm interested in the fate of a particular framework for explaining and responding to the race issue that I call racial individualism. And this describes theories that tended to view prejudice attitudes and discriminatory actions as the root cause of racial conflict, that made individuals the unit of analysis in studies of race relations, and that suggested that one could secure racial justice by changing the minds of discriminating individuals through education and protecting African American civil rights through legal change. In many ways, racial individualism brought together three of our most powerful post-war American discourses: psychological individualism, rights-based individualism, and assumptions about the socially transformative power of education. In many ways, I see racial individualism as the theoretical underpinning for post-war racial liberalism. And people define post-war racial liberalism in a lot of different ways. I find historian Walter Jackson's definition, which suggests that it's, in many ways, the set of political priorities that the mainstream civil rights movement put at the center of its efforts in the 40s and 50s that emphasized legal desegregation, anti-discrimination legislation, and anti-prejudice education. The second set of questions that my work emerges from is from intellectual history, the history of social science, and especially the history of applied social thought. And this is work associated with what some scholars call the politics of knowledge production. So research along these lines asks what factors make some ways of understanding a social issue more appealing or more influential than others. Scholars of the politics of knowledge production often distinguish between externalist and internalist dynamics, and so things internal or external to the thought itself. So externalist dynamics are things like funding patterns, hierarchies between disciplines, at times the race, class, gender of a researcher or an institution, and so this is a period where academic segregation is especially important. The political context, as opposed to internalist dynamics, which are things like theoretical commitments, methodological considerations, or assumptions about what constitutes scientific objectivity. And then a third set of questions that my work builds on and engages with emerge from the history of American education. And this is associated with studies of what historians of education often term educationalization. This is the tendency to see education as a panacea and to treat all social problems as fixable by education. The two most popular are economic inequality and poverty. So sort of educationalization suggests just the schools alone can solve those problems. I'm interested in the role assumptions about the socially transformative potential of education played in post-war racial liberalism, as well as in how different understandings of racism made some ways of thinking about educational reform seem more necessary than others. So if you understand the race issue is fundamentally rooted in white minds, then anti-prejudice education in schools and media campaigns to get to adults' attitudes are an appropriate solution. But if you understand racial inequality and injustice is rooted in labor exploitation, housing segregation, or political exclusion, if you understand racial oppression, as Kenneth Clark once put it, as American as apple pie, then the role that schools can and should serve in projects of racial justice is much more complicated. Building on these fields of research, I ask how and why racial individualism gained the traction it did between World War II and the early 1960s, and what explains the fate of social structural and political economic theories of the race issue in the post-war years. I emphasize the importance of convergence between scientific and political pressures, so I'm really interested in how externalist and internalist factors come to reinforce one another. And I also raise questions about the complexities of using social science in the service of social action or using social science in projects of racial politics. And in many ways, I'm really interested in how post-war social scientists, civil rights activists, and the many individuals who really blurred those roles negotiated their competing theoretical and political commitments. I get at these questions, my method is through a series of institutional case studies. So I have a chapter on the Rockefeller Foundation, especially influential philanthropy engaged in social scientific agenda setting on racial issues, a chapter on a race relations committee at the University of Chicago, which had been at the forefront of developing systemic theories of racial injustice in the 1920s, a chapter on Fisk's Race Relations Institutes, which were these interesting conferences that brought together social scientists and civil rights activists, Howard University's Journal of Negro Education, which was a journal focused on education and civil rights issues starting in 1932, and the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which was an important participant in religious anti-prejudice movements. Can you all in the back hear me? Do you need me to be louder? Okay. So I'm going to talk for a minute about the competing ways of understanding the race problem at work in the mid-century decades, and then I'll talk about some of the arguments I make about the nature of the competition between these frameworks. So visions of racism with very different theoretical orientations and programmatic implications competed in mid-20th century social scientific, scholarly, and reformist debate. And Charles Tilly's notion of the distinction between dispositional, systemic, and relational social theories was especially helpful as I was trying to categorize the different visions of the race issue at work in these years. At the same time, specific thinkers often kind of blurred the distinctions between these categories. So the categories don't fit perfectly, but I found them useful as a distinguishing device. Psychological theories were dispositional theories, so psychological approaches were essentially dispositional, meaning they pointed to an entity's orientation just before the point of action. That's how Tilly describes a dispositional theory. So individuals were usually the units of analysis. The focus was on motives, incentives, emotions, or attitudes, even though, as many social psychologists know, the impact of context on attitudes and on behaviors is a key concern. Examples of this approach are encapsulated in Harvard social psychologist Gordon Allport's 1954 claim in The Nature of Prejudice that it's only within the nexus of the personality that we find the effective operation of historical, cultural, and economic factors, unless mores enter the fiber of individual lives, right? So unless mores enter the fiber of individual lives, they are not effective agents, for it's only individuals who can feel antagonism and practice discrimination. Not surprising, he's a psychologist, a personality specialist, and to his credit, the book laid out the whole range of theories and then suggested this is what I think is really what is knowable. Psychological individualism often helped to inform and legitimize anti-prejudice education, though, as I argue, the relationship between the two wound up being much more complicated than I at first anticipated. Anti-prejudice education, various sorts of techniques, became especially popular during World War II. Not surprisingly, this was a war for democracy against Nazi racism that saw a number of troubling incidents of racial violence at home. So there were a series of urban racial disturbances in the 1940s that many social scientists, especially people at the University of Chicago who were in Chicago after the Detroit racial unrest, worrying that that might happen there, had very clearly in their minds. Supporters of anti-prejudice education employed a variety of approaches. School and college curricular interventions, and some of the psychologists involved in this work would test students before and after some kind of intervention. Various kinds of media campaigns. So the National Conference of Christians and Jews has this Brotherhood Week campaign that involved posters like this one: the best weapon against discrimination is the golden rule. How well is our religious education doing? Do we all know what the golden rule is? I was trying to explain it to my 3-year-old the other day to explain why she shouldn't knock over her brother, and whether they were more successful is debatable. But proponents of anti-prejudice education also used a variety of planned interracial contacts. So some of them took white kids on a tour of Harlem and tested their attitudes before and afterwards. The National Conference of Christians and Jews often used a roundtable technique where they brought together people from different groups to talk about their differences, hopefully to develop some kind of catharsis. Gordon Allport was a fan of intergroup contacts around shared tasks. So there was a lot of variety in anti-prejudice educational efforts. Important to note, I think, that it was not only psychologists who suggested that the race issue rested in white minds, and this is one of the things that I think is particularly important in the post-war period. So the Gordon Allport's The Nature of Prejudice, as well as the authoritarian personality, one scholar found, actually Thomas Pettigrew, who I think was here last year.
He's been a senior fellow for quite a while.
Yes. Found that actually the most cited volumes in sociology journals from 1944, among the most cited volumes in sociology journals from 1944 to 1968, were The Nature of Prejudice and The Authoritarian Personality. Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, also, which was touted as the study to end all studies when it came out in 1944, sponsored by the Carnegie Foundation, provided an example of how psychological assumptions permeated or moved into other kinds of disciplinary paradigms. Myrdal was an economist. He knew so little about the psychology of prejudice that when he started realizing his volume might have something to do with that topic, he commissioned E.L. Horowitz to write an annotated bibliography that he kind of tagged on to the end. The bulk of Myrdal's An American Dilemma, which was 1,000 pages, I was going to bring it to show you, but I didn't want to carry it, synthesized research on the politics and economics of Southern white supremacy and Northern racial segregation and inequality. And I have this picture of Myrdal, and this is Ralph Bunche, African-American political scientist at Howard for a long time, as a reminder that Myrdal is actually synthesizing the research of a generation of white and black scholars. The point is, the bulk of which was about the politics and economics of white supremacy. Nonetheless, assumptions about white psychology and morality became the thesis of An American Dilemma. So the famous moral dilemma thesis that frames the introduction and conclusion, which, since the volume was so long as the part many people read, was this: the American Negro problem is a problem in the heart of the American. Though our study includes economic, social, and political race relations, at bottom, our problem is the moral dilemma of the American, the conflict between his moral valuations on various levels of consciousness and generality, right? So the race issue is in white minds and white morality, but it's in white individuals somehow. It's unclear why he chose this framing. One historian suggests the war context and the fact that he sort of finished the volume back in Sweden after it had been sort of fallen to Nazi Germany, and the specter of irrationality changed his thinking. Others suggest he was wanted to kind of appease his sponsors at Carnegie. It's not entirely clear. Nonetheless, it was the moral dilemma thesis that supporters and critics paid attention to. So a second prominent way of understanding the mid-century race issue was a legal or rights-based approach. These theories, which are probably what we're most familiar with, so I'm not going to talk about them at great length, suggested that the race problem's roots lay in legal injustice, the state-sanctioned denial of African American rights as citizens. In this view, the protection of individual African American civil rights was the first priority, and this is the framework that motivates much of the NAACP's work against Plessy v. Ferguson, much of the fair housing and fair employment and open housing movements of the post-war years. Myrdal's work was also notable for linking assumptions about white morality to a rights-based definition of racial injustice that was essentially liberal, and here I mean kind of classically liberal. So at another point in his volume, he writes, if those rights, equal opportunity and individual civil rights, he's saying here, were respected, many other pressing social problems would of course still remain. Many Negroes would, together with many whites, belong to groups which would invoke the old ideals of equality and liberty and demanding more effective protection for their social and economic opportunities, but there would no longer be a Negro problem, right? So he defines the race problem as separate from issues of social and economic inequality. And it was really my interest in the intellectual history of our understandings of the relationship between race and class that brought me originally to this project. Well, racial individualism brought together psychological theories and ideas about rights in the post-war years. A number of alternatives to racial individualism were also at work and had been especially powerful in the 1920s, 30s, and 1940s. So a number of social structural frameworks tended to be what Tilly would call systemic in orientation, since they highlighted the causal power of social processes or social forces, presented societies or economies often as coherent, self-sustaining entities, and often situated events within some kind of broader system or structure. So for example, social anthropologists associated with Lloyd Warner and John Dollard and the caste and class school of social anthropology often describe cohesive cultural systems. Social ecologists associated with the Chicago School of social ecology, sociologists associated with the Chicago School of Social Ecology. It wasn't called social ecology by coincidence, right? They had these ecological metaphors, often talked about a social body. Many of the best known studies in these fields, often in contrast to focusing on individual actors, were community studies. They focused on case studies, so studies like Charles Johnson's Shadow of the Plantation, Dollard's Caste and Class in a Southern Town, Drake and Caton's Black Metropolis. Not all post-war work by social ecologists and social anthropologists took these approaches. Charles Johnson and E. Franklin Frazier also did these sort of giant volumes, the Negro in American Civilization or the Negro in the United States, that were really based on large bodies of statistical, usually census data, that documented patterns of racial inequality. But the real methodological innovation of much of this work was the community study or the case study. It's also worth noting that Robert Park trained many of the leading post-war sociologists of race relations. And much of the work in the post-war period built on, in some ways, on Robert Park's notion of the race relations cycle, which argued that large-scale technological and economic changes produced migration, competition over employment and space, conflict, and eventually accommodation, assimilation, and a new kind of social equilibrium. So this theory of the race relations cycle runs through the work of a number of post-war, or assumptions that there's some kind of nature, cyclical nature and patterns of race relations. Park was interesting because he was notable for the universality of his theory. So he often argued in the relations of races, there's a cycle that everywhere tends to repeat itself, as well as his assumptions about the kind of inevitable character of race relations cycles. He often described them as progressive and irreversible. And then finally, advocates of a political economic vision of the race issue exemplified what Tilly would call a relational approach, because they rooted causality in ongoing patterns of interaction between individuals or social groups. And so it's the relations between one group and another. That's the relational part of it. While both social structural and political economic theorists discuss conflict, political economic theories tended to emphasize economic exploitation and power relations a little more than social structural did. Although in practice, many scholars integrated aspects of social structural and political economic theories. One, I think, interesting example of the emphasis on power relations that was often present in political economic theories, but not necessarily in some of the more structural theories, was Oliver Cromwell Cox, who I'll talk about in a second, critiqued Warner's caste theory for not fully reflecting, as he put it, the role, essentially, that white violence played in the maintenance of white supremacy, right? So attention to political, to not only exploitation, but political oppression, often oppression sustained by violence, was at the heart of these kinds of theories. At the same time, in practice, many scholars integrated aspects of social structural and political economic theories. Exploitation theories had been especially popular among leftist, anti-racist intellectuals and activists during the Depression. So for the historians here, these are the groups that Jonathan Scott Holloway, Nikhil Singh, Tom Segru describe as the interwar interracial left, or the African-American lefts of those years. Some advocates of political economic frameworks, such as radical sociologist Oliver Cromwell Cox, who had also trained with Park, almost all these post-war sociologists had some interaction with Park, were especially critical of individualism. As Oliver Cromwell Cox put it, the point which the author seems to have avoided, and here he's talking about Myrdal, is this, that both race prejudice and Negro standards are consistently dependent variables. They're both produced by the calculated economic interests of the Southern oligarchy, right? So there's the political part of the political economy. Here in Myrdal's theory, beliefs are assumed to be prime movers. They keep the Negroes low. This is mysticism. If beliefs per se could subjugate a people, the beliefs which Negroes hold about whites should be as effective as those which whites hold about Negroes. So political radicals often embrace this vision, and yet many historians, sociologists, political scientists who were centrist liberals also rooted the race issue in the combination of political economy and social structure in the 1920s, 30s, and first half of the 1940s. Although different theoretical approaches to the race issue competed in this interwar period, a broad group of historians of social science and civil rights politics, and this is sort of the historiography, the literature I'm rooting myself in, suggested that an individualistic ethos became especially influential in the 15 years following World War II. The story is Gunnar Myrdal and Gordon Allport win, Oliver Cox loses, and sort of that sort of was the basic narrative in many ways. My book tries to figure out how and why racial individualism gained the traction it did, how individualistic theories competed with social structural and political economic theories, and what was the fate of alternatives to racial individualism in these years. And I think these questions are important because, as many scholars who are sort of upset with what racial liberalism left undone have argued, individualistic approaches to the race issue, while accomplishing a great deal in some ways, and I think recent incidents of police brutality suggest also very appropriate in some settings, also left much work for racial justice incomplete. So these theories failed to effectively fight racialized poverty and inequality. They didn't do a great job against segregation outside the South. They suggested that by securing equality before the law, the race problem had been solved. And in some ways, by focusing on intentionality, they lay some of the theoretical groundwork for contemporary colorblindness, which, as we know, has been sort of chipping away at affirmative action and school integration for a while now. One argument I make involves the ways intellectual and political pressures converged to favor racial individualism, especially how anti-radicalism, behavioralism, and scientism, all of which I'll define shortly, reinforced one another in the post-war politics of knowledge production. So I'll tell you a bit, for those of you who looked at Chapter 2, about a conference on research in human relations that the Rockefeller Foundation funds in 1953 to show in some ways how these patterns work together. This was an agenda-setting conference, and in case you were worried that the leading foundations got together scholars from the most elite universities, brought them together to help advise the foundation on what to fund in a given field, and then funded those scholars. It actually does seem like that was what was happening. You weren't worried.
We weren't worried. No.
So this Conference on Research and Human Relations is important to my story because it's the only setting where Rockefeller philanthropy seemed to have included racial issues in its social scientific agenda setting in the early 1950s. And it illuminates some of the pressures constraining the production of knowledge on the race problem. Part of the story was who was included. So there had been a number of interracial conferences in the 1920s that deliberately, and on interracial relations, that were run by the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial and the Social Science Research Council, had not really been theoretical in orientation, but really focused on addressing a social problem, were deliberately invited a group that was deliberately interracial in makeup, and also included both a wide range of activists as well as scholars in scholarly agenda setting. By the 1950s, only scholars at this Conference on Research and Human Relations, which was distinctly theoretical in orientation, only scholars from elite white research institutions were included in agenda setting. Moreover, in contrast to the 1920s, when the Rockefeller Foundation had funded many disciplinary approaches to racial questions, most notably including political economy, and it was no golden era. The Rockefeller Foundation in the 20s didn't want to offend its Southern donors, and so it was supportive of segregation. But they did fund an array of disciplinary approaches in the early period. By the 1950s, the Rockefeller Foundation treated the race issue as a fairly small, kind of insignificant aspect of the emerging theoretical field of human relations. A number of factors, I think, explain this shift in how the Rockefeller Foundation was treating the social science of race relations. The first is the rise of the behavioral sciences more broadly. And these scholars seem to use behavioral sciences and human relations interchangeably. Advocates of the behavioral sciences, which had become especially popular after World War II, tended to emphasize individual and group behavior to prioritize the intersection of psychology, culture, and society, to de-emphasize the political and economic. In some ways, this built on wartime experiments in interdisciplinary survey research, most notably Samuel Stouffer as an American soldier. And yet there was a lot of prestige and a lot of money behind the behavioral sciences revolution. The Ford Foundation funds a program in the behavioral sciences in 1949 that is responsible for the establishment of the Center for the Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences up the hill here at Stanford. Harvard dissolves its sociology and psychology departments in 1946 and establishes a Department of Social Relations. So it's an experiment, but it's an experiment with a lot of money and power behind it. Another aspect of the post-war context is anti-radicalism. So there's a long history of Americans treating racial issues as radical. Certainly the NAACP and much of the post-war period is doing everything it can to kind of defend its anti-communist credentials. And yet McCarthyist pressures were quite acute at the Rockefeller Foundation. In the early 1950s, when there were actually congressional investigations into the subversive or un-American activities of leftist foundations, at many of these congressional hearings, it was Myrdal's An American Dilemma that was brought out by the people attacking the foundations for their subversive activity as an example of the leftist propaganda that the foundations were supporting. And I will say, I did a radio interview and got an angry letter from somebody who thought I was saying that Myrdal's An American Dilemma was propaganda. I am not saying that. I'm saying that the congressional opponents of the foundations called it leftist propaganda as part of their attack on the foundations. But the point is that McCarthyism was very real for foundations in these years. The post-war years are also an era of ascendant scientism, which is a term for social scientific reliance on the investigative norms of the natural sciences. So advocates of scientism favored certain kinds of research, objective, aimed to produce theory, generalizable, often quantifiable, over others. What my chapter on the Rockefeller Foundation finds is that even some scholars who worried about the narrow focus on individuals in social scientific research on race tended to be committed to scientism in ways that favored individualistic approaches, especially when it came to method. And so the example I give is sociologist Robin M. Williams, who's from Cornell. He is the key researcher on this large, multi-year Cornell Studies in Intergroup Relations. He is probably behind the Rockefeller Foundation's Conference on Research in Human Relations, and he was the person at that conference who presented the paper on racial and cultural relations. He, on the one hand, in this paper, argued and was worried that much recent sociological work on race was limited by what he called its atomism, which was its tendency to treat prejudice as an unanalyzed aggregate of individual attitudes and to kind of separate those attitudes from the structural properties of groups and communities. And other sociologists in particular were worried about this pattern in the post-war years, E. Franklin Frazier in particular. And yet Williams, I think, exemplified the tension between a critique of atomism on the one hand and commitment to generalizability on the other, or a worry about what he often referred to as particularism, which was the opposite of generalizability. And if generalizability was the goal, then particularism was the greatest social scientific sin. It was having one case study here and not being able to show that it had larger general ramifications. So he believed that the most useful studies of race relations, is the quote here, were those that elucidated universal patterns that could be applied to any type of intergroup relations. Eventually, as he argued at one point, scholars shall not be studying Negro-white relations, Catholic-Protestant relations, Irish-Polish relations, but we shall be analyzing the relations between differently situated and differently categorized persons and selecting our cases wherever found on the basis of strategic interest of social science. So that's sort of the epitome of the hope for generalizability. Yet to get at this level of generalizability, you needed a really large data set. And as he worried at this conference, the key dilemmas were thus on the methodological side. Similar pressures, as I argue in my chapter on the University of Chicago, were also at work at the University of Chicago, even though that was a really surprising place for those dynamics to be at work. Pressures associated with behavioralism, scientism, and anti-radicalism did not, however, function in the same way across the academic world. And so, in many ways, my book is also a story about the importance of African-American-led intellectual spaces. So I have a chapter on Fisk's Race Relations Institutes, which were run by its Race Relations Department, started by sociologist Charles S. Johnson in the early 1940s. These were an interesting space, so they brought together social scientists interested in racial issues, and the institutes were themselves interracial, so people like Gordon Allport attended them, Lewis Worth, but they were led by African Americans at Fisk. And the first week, the institutes, with these 3-week summer conferences, the first week would be a discussion of interdisciplinary social scientific approaches to the race issue, and then the second 2 weeks involved a number of different kinds of activists dealing with racial issues in the field. So there were often people working for labor unions, religious groups, educators, people working both at the national and the local level in civil rights organizations. The Journal of Negro Education was, when it was established in 1932, celebrated itself as the first journal committed to the social scientific study of African American education. It was really as much, I think, a civil rights journal as it was a journal focused on the social science of African American education. And people like Walter White, Roy Wilkins, Thurgood Marshall, Alan Locke published consistently in the Journal of Negro Education. Fisk's Institutes and Howard's Journal of Negro Education, where each settings were theoretical alternatives to racial individualism, theories that rooted racism in political economy, historical processes, and social structure continued to circulate in post-war America. The common wisdom in many of these settings tended to challenge the claim the race problem originated in the minds and morals of white Americans. Instead, many framed racial issues in terms of exploitation and oppression. So, for example, sociologist Edgar T. Thompson, also trained by Park, who was a sociologist concerned with plantation societies, argued that the American racial situation was formed out of the need for black labor, as the idea of race developed as a working element in colonial areas as a means of effecting control over the Negro's labor and fixing him in a permanent caste position. In many ways, this is what Barbara Fields has argued much more recently, right? That the idea of race emerged from situations of labor exploitation. Or M.F. Ashley Montague, an anthropologist, these were both quotes from one of the Fisk Institutes, explained race prejudice is one of the most serious results of the competitive struggle to live, which characterizes our society. This is one more important reason why we must eliminate the conditions of economic distress. Horace Caton and Kenneth Clark, even in a session on the psychology of prejudice, discussed prejudice as a rationalization for oppression and exploitation. In both the JNE and at the Fisk Institutes, a toned-down version of the basic claim that racial prejudice emerged from and continued to exist not because it was a flawed attitude, not because it was related to some kind of personal pathology, but because it served white economic and political interests, ran through analyses offered by many scholars who were not political radicals, many scholars who were centrist liberals, people like Charles Johnson, Robert Weaver, Lewis Worth, Times Kenneth Clark. In addition, while wartime enthusiasm for anti-prejudice education and post-war behavioralism had some impact in these settings at Fisk and Howard, their influence was much more muted and qualified than in elite white institutions. So for example, the Journal of Negro Education in 1944 has a summer edition, it often had a special edition, summer edition each year, on education for racial understanding. And the journal featured discussions of the psychology of prejudice and what it showed about the best kind of anti-prejudice educational techniques. It was kind of surprising because the JNE, much like Howard in the 1930s, had really been a center of black leftist thought and a place where arguments linking race and class had been pretty mainstream. And yet the timing suggests, I think, that the JNE was acting strategically. So in some ways, I think a lot of the activists there wanted to turn broader wartime interest in prejudice towards the integrationist cause. And there were a few articles in this summer edition, one by J. Max Bond, who was a scholar of education from Tuskegee, the other by Carolyn Ware, a historian from Howard, that argued basically you can't have healthy democratic personalities without integrated schools. So sort of trying to use the enthusiasm of anti-prejudice education to promote the legal struggle for school integration. The approach to education for racial understanding was also, in both of these settings, I argue, always partial and cautious. So Martin Jenkins, who was a professor of education at Howard and future president of Morgan State College in Baltimore, recognized he was likely to be criticized for this narrow approach. And this is a quote from a letter he wrote to the editorial committee proposing the summer edition on education for racial understanding. He writes, "It's true that the educational approach is emotionally rejected by many because of the insistence by individuals and organizations antagonistic to the Negro that education rather than political pressure is the real solution to the problem." And then he says, but we need many approaches because it's a war on many fronts. But I think it's important to recognize that there is an important strand of thought in African-American-led settings that reflected, this is one of my favorite quotes, E. Franklin Frazier's 1924 critique of the politics of interracial cooperation and understanding, where he said the Negro does not want love, meaning, sympathy, support, and charity from white people. He wants justice. Which brings me to the last two arguments about scholar-activist dilemmas and political pragmatism. At the Race Relations Institute and Journal of Negro Education, I find, many social scientists continued to articulate social theories that challenged racial individualism in important ways, but embraced racial liberalism, especially in these settings, its rights-based approaches, right? So at the JNE and at Fisk's Institutes, there was always this skepticism of anti-prejudice education, but there was an immense amount of enthusiasm for rights-based approaches and the pursuit of human rights and the focus on legal desegregation, understandably. And so even though racial individualism continues to be critiqued, there was, I think, in many ways, an embrace of racial liberalism out of a sense of political practicality. In many ways, dilemmas associated with the scale of feasible reform made it difficult to translate systemic and relational theories, or social structural and political economic theories, into proposals for change that seemed realistic in the post-war political climate. So for a time at the Fisk Institutes between 1944 and 1947, many there advocated what I call a redistributive racial liberalism, where they combined an emphasis on legal desegregation and anti-discrimination legislation with sort of New Deal style calls for full employment, affordable housing, broad social welfare programming. However, given the grand scope of theories of exploitation and oppression, these efforts seemed to only address part of the problem being described. And after 1947, amidst rightward moving national politics, and especially after 1950, when significant progress in the legal battle against Plessy v. Ferguson was being made, Institute leaders consistently turned away from redistribution and toward struggles for legal desegregation and civil rights. In 1951, Charles S. Johnson actually decides he's going to reframe the Race Relations Institute's basic emphasis away from race relations and towards the democratic human rights. And the theme of the Institute in subsequent years reflect the enthusiasm for the NAACP's legal progress and the focus on rights. Many of the actors I examine, I think, were negotiating a distinction that sociologist Robin M. Williams articulated quite well in 1947 between the causes of a problem and what he described as levers of change. They seem to accept that, as he put it, the factors which are most important in producing hostility and conflict are by no means the same as those which are most important for control purposes. So all causes of a social problem are not necessarily an appropriate site for intervention. Which brings me to my last point, which is that the flip side of this process could also be true. Not only did scholar activists shy away from the reformist implications of systemic and relational theories because they seemed unrealistic, but things like anti-prejudice education, which seemed doable and was quite cheap in contrast to programs of social redistribution, and was never all that controversial, wind up being fairly popular. As media scholar and historian Lawrence L.D. Reddick put it in discussing American approaches to the race issue, revolution, oh no, new laws, maybe, education, yes indeed. So I think a broad array of groups that often disagreed on political priorities, even concerning legal desegregation and the timing of legal desegregation, could all agree that education had some role to play in solving the race issue. For example, the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which even though its main focus is on education for tolerance, refuses to come out in support of legal desegregation really until the early 1960s. And it's not a coincidence that Eisenhower was at times the image on their poster. Eisenhower had said when Brown was passed that he thought it would slow progress in Southern race relations for 15 years. So in some ways, the concerns that the critics that Martin Jenkins are discussing, that education would be in lieu of legal change, in some places actually were founded. At the same time, fervent integrationists at places like the American Council on Race Relations or Fisk's Race Relations Institutes also at times found utility for anti-prejudice education. So these are pamphlets discussing restrictive covenants and part of a campaign that people both at Fisk and at this is when I think Robert Weaver was at the American Council on Race Relations, were engaged in campaigns against restrictive covenants. They in interesting ways present kind of a systemic theory of the sources of urban racial inequality and suggesting how this one has restrictive covenant. The restrictive covenant is the lock around a kind of shackle or a lock, creating blight and overcrowding in African American inner cities when there's new homes for sale elsewhere. These documents I think are very interesting because they depict the systemic theory of the sources of urban racial inequality, but it's in a document whose aim is to change white minds. So anti-prejudice education could appeal to a broad range of groups, even though some saw it as a partial approach and some as a total approach. This broad popularity at times helped to shape research agendas, even among social scientists who were skeptical of narrowly individualistic theories of the race issue. So this was one piece that I found especially surprising. The authors of The Authoritarian Personality recognized they were likely to be criticized. This is from the foreword to The Authoritarian Personality. Recognized they're likely to be criticized for focusing on the personal and psychological, rather than the social aspect of prejudice. And yet, when defending this focus, they explained it in this way. Our aim is not merely to describe prejudice, but to explain it in order to help in its eradication. Eradication means re-education, and education is in a strict sense, by its nature, personal and psychological. So it was the assumption that educational reform was doable that motivated them to focus their study on psychology, even though they understood the race issue was much more complex. So So I'll just end with a thought about the dilemmas associated with political pragmatism. Kenneth Clark in 1993 was famously quoted as describing his life as a series of glorious defeats. And yet the passage that precedes this quote is this: "I am forced to face the likely possibility that the United States will never rid itself of racism and reach true integration. I look back and I shudder at how naive we all were in our belief in the steady progress racial minorities would make through programs of litigation and education." I suspect the constraints he and his colleagues were up against were as important as a kind of naivete. He was there, I was not, but I think the importance of the constraints they were facing was crucial, given the post-war context, one marked by success in the legal arena, as well as McCarthyism, rightward moving national politics, emerging Southern backlash to civil rights gains, as well as by the rise of the behavioral sciences, enthusiasm for attitude-based survey research, and scientism, that so many thinkers embraced individualistic reforms, psychological, educational, and rights-based, that did not reflect the true complexity of their theories is entirely understandable, and yet I think it's important to know the history of these patterns of political pragmatism, because on the one hand, they raise really pressing but also important questions about the role social science can and should play in projects of racial justice, and they also help to explain the work that remains to be done to fight racial inequality, injustice, and racialized poverty more than a half century later.